show. So first of all, welcome everybody. I'm Jeffrey Weidlinger, the director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies here at the University of Michigan. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you tonight to the inaugural Padnos Public Engagement on Jewish Learning event on the topic of the historical Jesus in his Jewish context. In 1988, the Padnos family made their first gift to Jewish studies at the University of Michigan, establishing a visiting professorship. As part of that endowment, the Padnos professor would give a series of public talks in Ann Arbor and in Grand Rapids. In keeping with their longtime generosity towards the program and vision in public programming, the Padnos family recently created another endowment in support of public outreach in Judaic studies across the state of Michigan, with a special focus on the western part of the state. Although this year we're all stuck in our living rooms, we hope that in future years, Padnos public engagement activities will be held in different locations around Michigan and will foster innovative collaboration, a collaboration that has already begun, and will also foster interfaith conversation. I am pleased, though, that this remote format has given us the opportunity to reach new diverse audiences. We had over 500 people register in advance to attend tonight's session and have almost that many here in the room with us right now. And this time, I'm pretty sure that none of them have come just for the bagels. They have come, no doubt, to hear from our distinguished panelists, who I will introduce now and then tell you a little bit about the format for tonight's evening. Gabriele Boccaccini is professor of Second Temple Judaism and early rabbinic literature here at the University of Michigan. He's the founding director of the Enoch Seminar and a specialist on apocalyptic literature, the Jewish context of the New Testament, and the origins of the Abrahamic faiths. He's the author most recently of the book, Paul's Three Paths to Salvation, which was published in September 2020. In 2019, he was awarded knighthood by the President of Italy in recognition of his outstanding contributions to the promotion of Italian culture. Next year, he'll be serving as the head fellow for the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies theme year on the challenge of diversity in Second Temple Judaism. This evening, Professor Boccaccini will be interviewing Amy Jill Levine. Professor Levine is University Professor of New Testament and Mary Jane Werthan Professor of Judaic Studies at Vanderbilt Divinity School. A specialist on the Judaic context of the New Testament, she's the author and co-author of many books, including The Misunderstood Jew, The Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus, and The Meaning of the Bible, What the Jewish Scriptures and the Christian Old Testament Can Teach Us. In October 2020, she published her most recent book, The Bible with and Without Jesus, How Jews and Christians Read the Same Stories Differently. She has been active in interfaith conversations and adult education, as well as an author of children's books. And in spring 2019, she was the first Jew to teach New Testament at Rome's Pontifical Biblical Institute. And just this past weekend, she delivered a sermon at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., which I would encourage you all to watch. I watched it recently, and it's really fantastic to listen to her. Following Professor Boccaccini and Professor Levine's conversation, Jeremiah Cataldo will provide a brief commentary. Professor Cataldo is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Grand Valley State University. Among his publications are Biblical Terror, Why Law and Restoration in the Bible Depend Upon Fear, and A Social Political History of Monotheism from Judah to the Byzantines. And we thank you very much for joining us as well, Professor Cataldo. Just to give you a sense of the format, Professor Levine and Boccaccini will first have a conversation for about 35 minutes or so, after which Professor Cataldo will give a commentary for a few minutes, about 5 minutes. We will then return to Professors Levine and Boccaccini, and Professor Boccaccini will moderate questions. Throughout the talk and throughout the time that Professor Boccaccini and Levine are conversing, feel free to pose questions by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and Professor Boccaccini will moderate those questions afterwards, as well as pose his own questions and respond to Professor Cataldo. The chat has been disabled, but if you have any questions, again, please use the Q&A button. So without further ado, welcome to the inaugural Padnos Public Engagement on Jewish Learning event, The Historical Jesus in His Jewish Context. and I will turn things over to Professor Boccaccini.
Thanks, Jeffy, very, very much for your words of introduction. It is really a pleasure to be here in conversation with my friend, Professor Amy Levine, on the historical Jesus. Let's start immediately from the obvious truth. Jesus was a Jew.
It's a good start.
Yes, it's a good start. What else could it have been? In his life, Jesus did nothing that today we would consider typically Christian. He did not receive a Christian baptism. He was circumcised. He never went to church. He preached in the synagogue. He never celebrated Christmas or Easter. He celebrated the Jewish festivals of Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. He never read or studied the New Testament or the letters of Paul. He read and studies the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the Torah of Moses, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. He was a Torah observant Jew who kept the dietary laws and celebrated the Shabbat. For him, Sunday was only the first day of the week. In sum, Jesus did nothing that today we would consider typically Christian. Jesus was born, lived, and died a Jew. To say that Jesus was a Jew, however, does not mean that he was a Jew like everyone else, because in his time, as today, there are many different ways of being a Jew. So the real question, the real historical question that we will try together to discuss is rather what kind of Jew Jesus was. This is the real question, not that Jesus was a Jew. He was.
Right.
Many of our misconceptions about Jesus stem from our misconception about Judaism in what Judaism was in the first century. And I think, MJ, that we should begin exactly from this problem. Why the understanding of Second Temple Judaism and its diversity should be seen as the first step in any discussion of historical Jesus.
Absolutely, because if we get the Second Temple Jewish context wrong, we're necessarily going to get him wrong. So he has to make sense in that first century context. People have attempted to define what kind of Jew he is. He's an apocalyptic Jew, or from John Meijer, he's a marginal Jew. Or we try to box him into categories as if the only thing Jews could be were Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots, as if that's the sum total. Judaism is remarkably diverse. And there's no head Jew to tell Jews what to do. And you know what? If there were, we wouldn't listen anyway. Because you're held together. Jews are held together because they're an ethnos. They're a people group. It's kind of like talking about Americans. Democrats don't necessarily agree with Republicans, as we've seen most recently. People in Michigan may have different attitudes than people in Tennessee, where I live. So Jesus is his own kind of Jew. And then if we can narrow that down, I think he is a Jew who's interested in the inbreaking of what he called the kingdom of God, or a sense that there's going to be a change in time between what is happening now and what will happen when God somehow formally enters into history to bring about the kingdom of heaven, or the Olam Haba, or the world to come, whatever you want to call it. I think he's a Jew who's because he's interested in this sense of the end of the world, what he's doing is he's preparing his followers to live as if they've already got one foot in that kingdom. I think he's separating families. He's pulling the younger generation away from the older generation. I don't think he's particularly interested in people having children. I think he wants people to be more like little kids than to produce them. So his family values are not quite what we think of today when we think of family values or focus on the family. I think he's a popular leader, so much so that the Roman system perceives him to be a threat, and that's why they killed him. I think he's a storyteller who told memorable stories. I also think he was a healer and an exorcist. And that's just to start.
Yes, I certainly agree, Jay. I mean, Jesus must be understood in the diversity of Second Temple Judaism without trying to, I mean, to put him in a box, let's put it this way. Yes. But at the same time, to put him in conversation with all the other groups and movements that existed at the time and made the time so lively. I think that a lot of our problems, our difficulties in understanding the period is because we too often try to transfer back on Second Temple Judaism later models of Judaism or prejudice that derive from a long history of confrontation between Christians and Jews. I would say that traditionally there has not been much interest among Jews in the history of the Second Temple period. Very often the tendency has been to retroject into the past many of the ideas that were developed only later by the rabbis, as if they were normative, already normative at the time of Jesus. And from the Christian point of view, there is a long tradition of misinterpreting Second Temple Judaism as an age of decadence after the golden age of biblical prophecy. Today, new sources and archaeology are telling us that this was not the case. So my second question would be, which are, in your opinion, the primary sources and the main archaeology discoveries that we should look at to have a better understanding of historical Jesus? And also, we know that the Gospels are theological accounts, so they are not historical accounts to be read literally, but how reliable are they in order to understand the historical Jesus?
You have just asked, I think, about 6 separate questions. So let me see if I can parse them out. And they're wonderful, wonderful questions. I think we have to start by defining what Second Temple Judaism is, just to make it clear to everybody. And it's a type of Second Temple Judaism. It's not all of it. So when the Jews returned, or the Judeans returned from the Babylonian exile, when Persia conquered Babylon in 538, that's more or less this beginning of this repatriation, and culture changes, and they start rebuilding the temple that had gotten burned down by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar. And you begin to see that temple kind of popping up around the year 515 or so BCE. You can see that with the prophets Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And that would be considered early Second Temple Judaism. So you have about 100 years of Persian rule. And then in 333, Alexander the Great comes in and conquers the Persians. And now we have Greek rule. So you have Jews with this first Persian influence and then Greek influence. You eventually have the Greek Empire splitting up, and the Jews first come under Ptolemaic rule in Egypt. And then they come under the Seleucid Greek rule. This gets us to the holiday of Hanukkah. I've just done about 400 years in 2 seconds. The Maccabees take over in about 165, and you have an autonomous Jewish rule from 165 to 67 when the Romans come in and stayed. When we talk about Jesus' context, we're usually talking about what we would call late Second Temple Judaism, which is primarily the Roman period. So we're thinking from about 67 BCE up to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 by the Romans. Jesus lived sometime in the beginning of the 1st century. So year 1 is arbitrary, probably sometime between 7 and 4 BCE. He dies sometime between 26 and 36. Paul is writing starting in the 40s, and the Gospels are written after 70. That's more quick history than most people can digest, but trust me on this. Now, this gets to part of your question about how people will sometimes use rabbinic literature and retroject what the rabbis are saying in the Talmud. So a rabbi living in the 3rd century Common Era gets retrojected back into the 1st century Galilee, which is bad. Part of that retrojection actually relates to what we call this thing, or this time period. For a number of years, the time of Jesus was known as late Judaism, Spätjudentum in German, late with the sense of pretty much dead. Yeah, ossified. It had come down from the wonderful time of the prophets to become in the Second Temple period run by the priest, this legalistic letter of the law, but not spirit of the law, depressing, angry God of wrath. the epitome of misogyny, where women were oppressed, repressed, suppressed, and depressed. And everybody is trying to follow the law, which is making them either neurotic or sanctimonious. And then the idea was that Jesus comes along and invents social justice, concern for the poor, women's rights, a view of God as benevolent, and otherwise corrects this late Judaism. And that's just not the way to do it. So at the turn of get my centuries mixed up, around 1900 or so, we started getting a lot of people Christians reading Jewish sources somewhat haphazardly. And the idea was to take a Talmudic quote, whether from the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, or the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, usually some rabbi saying something not terribly pleasant, and retrojecting that into the first century, and then reading some positive statement from Jesus over or against it. And that still happens, so that when we look at biblical studies books today, find a number of people who are citing rabbinic sources that they've never read, and they pick the source up from some footnote, from some footnote, from some footnote. And a number of Christians have played this very nasty game of taking problematic rabbinic comments and comparing them to very good Jesus comments. And that just makes Judaism look bad. But what they've done is they've falsely constructed what Second Temple Judaism is. You can't simply go to a rabbinic text that's written in the 3rd century, in the 4th century in Babylon, and say that's what Jewish life was like at the time of Jesus, any more than you can look at Christian life after Constantine and say that's what's going on in Paul's churches. So what we need to do is zero in on what life was like in the 20s and 30s in Galilee and in Judea, and try to determine what was going on with Jesus then. And that brings us to questions of archaeology. It brings us to questions of source criticism. It brings us to questions of politics and sociology.
Yes, I completely agree. I mean, because when we start talking of Second Temple Judaism, first of all, I mean, we have to fight against the Christian idea that this was a time of decadence, a time of corruption, as if Jesus came to destroy Judaism, to destroy the bad religion of Judaism, and to restore the Bible and to restore the prophets. Okay. On the other hand, we have to understand that Judaism at the time was very different from what we today call Judaism. The same is true, obviously, for the Jesus movement, that is very different from what we call now Christianity, because the religion was based on a temple, not on the synagogue. So there are, at the same time, I think that modern scholarship has emphasized a lot the diversity of the Second Temple period and the diversity of groups, movement, expressions. And this really has helped to understand Jesus again as a Jew, because at the same time allows us to say that Jesus belonged to Judaism, and at the same time to say that he did it in his own way. As I said before, saying that Jesus was a Jew, it doesn't mean that he was just like anybody else. The discussion about Jesus' original contribution to Jewish thought is more lively than ever. I mean, some, as you said, emphasize the apocalyptic aspects of Jesus, the expectation of the end of times, the coming of the Messiah, the liberation from the power of evil. Others emphasize the ethical teachings of Jesus about forgiveness, love to neighbors, a very special attitude toward some specific groups, women, poor, sinners. So the question that I've always asked when I talk about the story of Jesus is, which are the most distinctive element in Jesus' preaching, and on the other hand, which are the least distinctive? Right.
And it's very hard to determine, because we don't have that many people or groups with whom to compare him specifically. The only Pharisee from whom we have written records is Paul of Tarsus, which is a bit problematic.
Yeah.
We've got the other groups as filtered by Josephus, who has his own agenda. And when Jesus does his own thing, I think pretty much all Jews were doing their own thing, because Jews are free to disagree with other Jews. So Pharisees would disagree with Pharisees, and I suspect that Zealots would disagree with Zealots. And heaven knows, we don't even know whether the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls were Essenes. I think they were, but we can't prove it. So to determine how he's distinct requires a substantial knowledge of what everybody else was doing at the time. And we really can't do that. So even the distinctive materials tend to be a guess. I think for me, the distinctive aspect is not the individual teachings, but the package.
Mhm.
So not everybody who would be invested in apocalyptic or eschatological concerns, I think not everybody who was doing that would also be invested in healings, for example, although they may be invested in exorcism. I think a lot of people who are concerned about ethics are also concerned about how marriages work and how families would relate in terms of ethics. I think Jesus is interested in what we would call fictive kinship groups rather than mummy and daddy and me. I don't think Jesus is a peasant. I think he's an artisan. So even when we start talking about what's his social class, most of the stuff that we have comes from people in the upper classes, like Josephus or Philo. So how do we figure out how artisans who would move in between the peasant class, the workers on the one hand, and the upper class on the other relate? Here are some of the things I think that are distinctive. I'm not happy with the term unique, because I think unique is actually a theological category. Is manishtana ha'ish hazeh, mikol ha'ileh, like why is this guy different from all other people? I don't want to go there. I think his parables are distinctive. In the same way, I think that Aesop's fables are distinctive, and I think he was known as a storyteller. And when I look at comparable wisdom sayings, mashalim, parables, Aesop's fables, I see a greater openness in Jesus' stories, and plus he doesn't tell animal stories for reasons I haven't figured out. I think his economic concerns are distinctive. I think he's got an inner circle of people who actually do fully divest of everything, and they relocate from their homes up in the Galilee to Jerusalem. We know that because Paul tells us that, and Acts tells us that. I think he makes stuff up on his own. I don't think he's got like a book saying, here's how you do Torah. I think people come up to him and say, what do you think about this? And then he says, well, here's what I think. He's the only person I know who actually says, love your enemies. He is distinctive in terms of his, in terms of some of the insults that he hurls at people. And he's distinctive because his followers were convinced that he came back from the dead, and that you got to have some sort of charisma there. And I think we sell short the idea of charisma. I mean, the individual power this man must have had, that I think people looked at him and they thought, yeah, whatever you're saying is actually true. This must be it. A quick story on this. This is how he came to this. And I don't mean to be political here, but many, many years ago, when Bill Clinton was president, he came to Vanderbilt and he gave a talk at a relatively small auditorium. And I was chairing the faculty senate at the time, so I got an invitation. And I was disappointed in some of the moves that he had made. And I came thinking, I don't like this man. And within about 5 minutes, I'm thinking I should write a check to the Democratic National Committee. And my husband, who was with me, looked at me and said, what are you doing? And I said, but listen to him. There was something about this man's charisma that he just had me. And I think they've said the same thing about Elvis Presley, and I don't want to compare Jesus to Elvis or Jesus to Bill Clinton, but I do want to talk about this sense of charisma and take that really seriously.
I like very much when you started with say that the originality is in the package, not in the single elements. Okay, because when I have to explain to my student in my class of historical Jesus the diversity of Second Temple Judaism, I tell my students, look, it's like children playing Lego. So they are all using the same material, the same bricks, Okay, so when you see different characters, different documents from the Second Temple period, they are all playing with the same elements. I mean, if we take one element after the other, are exactly the same. What makes different one from another is the building. Mm-hmm. I remember when I was a child, I was crazy about Lego, and one of the plays that I were doing with my brother and my friends was exactly to show our ability using exactly the same bricks to build something that was completely new and unexpected. So this is the reason why we can find a lot of parallels with everything that Jesus said. But as you said, the problem is in the package. If I may add the question, we have many documents from the period. I mean, because many Jews or Christians think that Second Temple Judaism is a time of silence. Mm-hmm. Between the Bible and the New Testament, or between the Bible and the Mishnah. But it's not. I mean, we have a lot of material, a lot of documents from this period, and I think that some of them may contain some very important elements in order to understand Jesus. You know that I am particular fond of the tradition of the Book of Enoch, of the Book of the Parables of Enoch in particular, but the documents that were found in Qumran, of course, what Flavio Josephus wrote, but a lot of material. I mean, which you think are the most interesting documents from the period, not written by Christians, but can help us understanding the figure of Jesus?
Yeah, well, I have to gloss the question because Paul never thought of himself as a Christian either.
Yes.
So if I can put Paul in there, I'd like to do that. I think there's more to be done on not only the Enochic corpus and not just chapters 37 to 71, the parables, but to look at some of the texts are sometimes called pseudepigrapha. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot of them can be mined. I think the Apocalypse of Abraham has some really interesting stuff in it, the Testaments of Abraham. In terms of the time that the Gospels were written, to do more on 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, to try to determine exactly how people reacted to the destruction of the temple. Looking at some of this post-70 material is really helpful in order to contextualize the Gospels, because the Gospels are writing to people who are living after the destruction of the temple. And in order to determine their attitude about Jesus, we need to know, among other things, what is their attitude about the destruction of the temple? So working us back that way. Recent excavations in Magdala, including what looks like a table on which Torah could be read, fabulous. Looking at graves that are being opened, looking at the numerous excavations of mikvaot, stone vessels, the question of purity in antiquity. So the more archaeology we do in Lower Galilee, we know how more important purity practices become. I think there's more to be done on coin hoards, and even on how people are assessing the images on, say, the coins of Herod Antipas, for example, and what's going on in Galilee. So there's a lot that can be done. Do we have lots of stuff? Yes. But compared to people who work on, say, the US Civil War, we're evidence poor.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's important that you mentioned Paul. I mean, because, you know, a lot of people think that the problem of rediscovering the Jewishness of Jesus to a certain extent is applied only to Jesus, but we have the same problem with Paul. I mean, right. Paul also was a Second Temple Jew, and there is a strong tendency now, certainly we are part of this tendency in scholarship, to see the entire New Testament as Second Temple Jewish literature. I mean, so the problem of Jewishness is not something that applies to the figure of Jesus only. I mean, it's something that asks us to reconsider the entire phenomenon of Christian origins as a movement that was born within Judaism, and then only later, only later for a series of circumstances, then parted. But I think that it's important to look at the problem of Jewishness of Jesus not in isolation, and I hope that we'll have soon another interesting conversation on the Jewishness of Paul.
Right. So it's Judaism in the diaspora, but Paul's Judaism as a diaspora Jew might be different than the diaspora Judaism of Priscilla and Aquila, two of Paul's friends who came from Rome. Judaism on the island of Delos is going to be different than Judaism in Alexandria in Egypt. And we also have to worry about diversity in terms of education, in terms of class. The Herodian families type of Judaism is going to be different than a Jew who happens to be a slave, who was a war captive, or who was an immigrant from one place to another. Men and women are going to have different views as well as older people and younger people, able-bodied people, and people who have diseases or disabilities. All this stuff is Jewish history, and the sad thing is that Jews don't know it. So in the synagogue where I grew up, we were very good up until the 160s BCE, the Hanukkah story, and suddenly, like magic, we skipped over the entire late Second Temple period, and we landed in the Mishnah, which is written down about the year 200, 210, 220, and we missed all this stuff. The first person in literature ever called rabbi is Jesus of Nazareth. If you want to know about Jewish women's life in the first century, the New Testament's the best source that we've got. But Jews don't know it. And Christians who focus on questions of salvation and how Jesus saved tend not to know about the Second Temple Jewish context in which he lived. So one of the things I keep telling my students is, at Vanderbilt Divinity School, I'm training people who want to be Christian ministers or religious educators. If you claim to love Jesus, you would want to know as much as possible about the place and the time where he lived. In the same way, if you fall in love with somebody, you want to know about their childhood and their parents and their friends, and what they ate and what they wore. So if you want to know about Jesus, you have to know about Second Temple Judaism. And if you want to know about Jewish history, conversely, you need to know about Jesus and Paul, because they are part of our history.
Yes, and I think that we should not be afraid of including in this conversation also some elements that tradition has been considered like divisive. The problem of messianism, the problem of superhuman origin or evil, the problem of forgiveness of sins, because these are Jewish problems of the Second Temple. So sometimes our perception, just this idea of distinguishing between Jewish and Christian topics, Jewish and Christian elements. Sometimes we have some colleagues that are reading Paul or Jesus or the Gospels with a red pen, trying to separate what the sentences that are Jewish and the sentences that are Christian. They're all Jewish. Even in the most radical or in the most controversial issues are part of a conversation that existed in the Second Temple. So I think we have to recover this kind of unity of the Second Temple and to reclaim the Christian component as part of the Second Temple, not simply as the background that we study in order to understand Jesus. Okay, because as you said, the Gospels are also telling us a lot about Judaism.
Part of the problem may be just the term Christian, because as soon as we use it, as you mentioned at the beginning, we associate it with baptism, with Eucharist, with worshiping Jesus, with the cross. And that's anachronistic. That's just as anachronistic as taking rabbinic literature and retrojecting it back into the first century. So we might want to think of other terms like Messianic Judaism or Jesus-centered Judaism or Christ-centered Judaism. But once we start talking about Christian, we risk importing too much in that ought not to be there.
Yes, exactly. When you start talking about Christianity, it's like talking of rabbinic Judaism, something that did not yet existed in the way in which we are familiar. And my final question in our conversation is exactly about the relationship, the implications of these discussions also for the contemporary relations between Christians and Jews, because as we know, for a long time, Christians have read Jesus in opposition to Judaism, and Jews have seen Jesus as an apostate that betrayed the religion of his ancestors. Fortunately, this belongs to the past, or at least should belong to the past, because there are still a lot of prejudice, a lot of stereotypes. The Holocaust, I think, has made the Christians and Jews dramatically aware of the consequences of anti-Judaism, and led to a better mutual appreciation of the Jewishness of Jesus and the unbroken Jewish roots of his movement. There are scholars today, including myself, who describe Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism as two parallel developments of the ancient religion of Israel, two non-identical siblings born from the same womb. It seems that historical research is giving, in this sense, an important contribution to the definition of the relations between Christianity and Judaism. How, are big questions, but how should we explain in this new context the fact that a Jewish teacher like Jesus and Paul gave birth to a separate religion? Was this their intention, or was the consequence of later historical circumstances? And in general, why these historical discussions are so important, so crucial to current relations between Christians and Jews?
Yeah, well, let me take the last question first, is why is this important? Because as I started, if we get Second Temple Judaism wrong, we're going to get Jesus wrong. And what frequently happens is not only is Second Temple Judaism misconstrued by well-meaning people, but ministers and religious educators on the Christian side. But if you get it wrong, what happens is you get preaching and teaching that either introduce, inculcate, or reinforce anti-Jewish stereotypes. And we can't afford to be teaching people in little kids in Sunday school and people in churches all sorts of negative lies about Jews and Judaism, because we've seen what happens on our own US soil when little Christian kids grow up to be adult Christian bigots. And I don't think that most of the people, the Sunday school teachers, the ministers who were misconstruing Second Temple Judaism are bigoted. I don't think that at all. I think they're ignorant, because the work that you do, the work that I do, the work that historians done has not sufficiently filtered down to churches, and in some cases to seminaries. So that's why it's important, as opposed to just an academic exercise. How would we better look at this? If we understand the diversity of Second Temple Judaism, by looking at the different sources, there's no way other than that we can understand Jesus better. How do we do it? Here are some of the things that we still have to do. Source criticism is back on the table. It had been for generations the idea that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are over here and John's over here, and they never had anything to do with each other. And increasingly, thanks to the work of folks like Jimmy Barker and Mark Goodacre, the idea is, oh, well, maybe John does have access to the Synoptic Gospels. Others are making the suggestion that the Gospel of John, which is so highly theological, in the beginning was the Word, actually has some good historical stuff in there, particularly about scenes in Judea. So John's back on the table in terms of historical critical work. People are now debating again whether the author of Luke in the book of Acts was a Gentile or a Jew or some sort of God-fearer. That's back on the table again, thanks to work of people like Mark Kinzer and Isaac Oliver. So the whole source critical thing is of issue. We used to think that the Gospels were written to tiny conventicles, little communities, like Matthew was a Jew writing to Jewish Christians or something like that. But we know that Matthew was the most popular gospel in the 2nd century among the Gentiles. So we open that up. Now, on the question of why did this become a new religion? Well, I don't think the Jesus movement took off very much in the broader Jewish world. Proclaiming an apocalyptic eschatological movement where you're supposed to hate your mother, your father, your wife, and your children and come follow Jesus, that's not going to get a huge amount of traction. It's going to get some, but not a huge amount. Most people just want to get through the day. Proclaiming a crucified Lord is a political liability. So that's a bit of a problem. And proclaiming that the Messiah had come when there's still death, there's still war, there's still disease, there's no ingathering of the exiles, including the 12 tribes, which at that point had been lost for a good 700 years. There's no peace on earth, so clearly the Messianic age had not arrived. So I think probably a lot of Jews who might have originally signed on with Jesus waited a year, waited 2 years, waited 3 years, and then went back to their homes in the Galilee and said, I think we'll have to keep waiting. Meanwhile, through Jews who had contacts in the diaspora meaning places outside the land of Israel, the idea that this Messianic age had begun, and one of the signs that many Jews thought was constitutive of the Messianic age was it was the time when Gentiles will turn from their pagan gods to worship the God of Israel. So Jesus' followers were proclaiming that. And at the same time, they're saying to people, you know, if you're hungry, we'll give you food. And if you're thirsty, we'll give you something to eat. And if you're in prison, we will come visit you. And if you're lonely, we will be your family. And if you're dying, we will sit by your bed and wait with you. So those early followers of Jesus took this very Jewish ethical package, proclaimed it to the Gentiles, and they said to Gentiles, including slaves and poor people, you can join our movement for free and you get eternal life and forgiveness of sin and a new family. It's the best deal in the agora, right? So in the religious marketplace of the Gentile world, the Christian message really resonated. So as time goes on, fewer and fewer Jews are part of the program, more and more Gentiles, and it necessarily became different. Why? Because Jews are still following Torah. As you mentioned before, they're honoring the Sabbath. They're going to synagogue. They're circumcising their sons. They're keeping the dietary laws. They're wearing tzitzit. They're wearing fringes. They're praying with phylacteries. They're doing all this Jewish stuff. But that stuff was not meant for the Gentiles. Because when the Messiah comes, the Gentiles worship the God of Israel. But they don't convert to being Jews, because then the only people who would be worshiping God would be Jews, and God has to be the God of the world. The prophet Zechariah talks about the day, this Messianic age, when 10 Gentiles grab hold of the Jew and say, take me with you to Zion so we can worship your God, right? But they don't say circumcise us when we get there. So the Gentile followers of Jesus, who were not what we would call halachically obedient, not following Jewish law in general, they become the majority. And within a century or so, Jews who are members of this movement, who are keeping kosher and circumcising, suddenly are no longer normal. They're coming on the side of being heretics. And we begin to have a new religion, and Christianity lost its sense of its Jewish roots. And then, because there were still Jews there who did not sign on to the program, developed anti-Jewish teaching to somehow deal with that, with those Jews who should have converted and didn't.
Thanks, Jay. I would like now to let Jeremiah, to call Jeremiah into the conversation so that we can now continue this conversation with three voices and just to hear your response to our conversation.
All right, thank you, and thank you to both of my colleagues. And I want to say that I agree largely with what is said here. And there's quite a range to respond to. We've covered the historical Jesus, the animosity between Jews and Christians, and more. And I love it. I feel like we're in my academic playground. But that said, I'll still try to keep my comments brief since we're getting close to the end of our allotted time. And I want to give some of the guests here a chance to ask questions as well. And so some of what I'm going to say will be posed as a rhetorical question or rhetorical questions, and some just a summary of main points covered. I agree that understanding the diversity of Judaism is critical, absolutely critical for understanding the development of Judaism and Christianity as unique religions in and of themselves. And doing so may offer materials for breaking down some of the animosities between Jews and Christians, a point that my colleague AJ mentioned in a variety of ways at various points. And not only that, I agree entirely that reconstructions of Second Temple Judaism are problematic. And part of the problem, I think, is that there's a modern tendency to homogenize all of Judean culture, politics, and even religion. And that homogenization tends to bleed over into the way that sources are treated. And regarding these sources, there's again a tendency to overlook the fact that most, if not all, of the biblical authors, and if we can include the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible, did not view themselves as biblical authors. Rather, they were trying to address social and political circumstances. And so a lot of times I wonder how often we overlook the social and political components and qualities of what we deem to be the biblical text in lieu of a more theological interpretation, and how much of an issue that might play into a lot of these problems that we're having with respect to, does Jesus play a role within Jewish tradition or not, and why is there a conflict between Jews and Christians today? Jesus has become inevitably, maybe not inevitably, but he has become a symbol that reflects tendencies toward defining distinctions between Jews and Christians. And so this was toward the latter part of the exchange here. I agree. I'd like to see Jesus become more a part of Jewish dialogue. But how do we get past the, for lack of a better way of framing this, the theological agenda or baggage even that Jesus entails in the modern context to make Jesus, or to bring Jesus back into Jewish dialogue in a way that doesn't frame Jesus, that we don't have to approach Jesus from a Christian framework, but from a Judean framework, rather than what theology has turned Jesus into. And this was an academic question. I wrote it down and I debated on whether or not I wanted to ask this, given the forum here. But this is my academic question for AJ, and you could feel free to just let this one fly by. But why not social scientific criticism instead of source criticism as a way of helping bring back some of these concerns, or the social and political and the historical contexts in a way that might help get around some of the baggage, for lack of a better phrase, that we've been talking about? Is it also a problem that we tend to see Jesus foremost as a religious figure, as well as, and perhaps a question that is somewhat parallel to what AJ was saying earlier on, that this tendency from a modern perspective to treat Judaism of the past in a homogeneous way. It was an absolute diversity of thought within Second Temple Judaism, and to speak of as though there were one doctrinal idea or identity of Judaism in the past is wrong. In light of all of that, one thing that I keep coming back to, or I kept coming back to in the exchange between my colleagues, was this question, and I have to ask it carefully because the term is anachronistic, but for lack of a better way of phrasing it, can we separate a type of nationalism from early forms of religion? Do we run the risk too often of talking about religion as a thing in and of itself and imposing that upon the past, using a modern framework of what we now have defined as religion? And in doing so, do we overlook the cultural elements, the political elements, the social elements, the economic elements that were very much a part of what the biblical authors were trying to do, and even the teaching, and even what Jesus was trying to do? Can we really talk about religion as something distinct in the ancient world, as something distinct from politics and so on? So these were summary points, but also rhetorical questions, and also some questions that you could use for a response. But again, I want to say thanks to my colleagues. I largely agree with what you guys have shared and said.
Can I start?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. These are great questions. I'm going to try to do these as efficiently as possible. It's good that I'm from Massachusetts and I speak quickly. The whole politics and theology thing actually leads to the question of homogenization. If you take a theological view, then it has to be Jesus over against everybody else. And that gets you into questions of politics as well. In terms of social scientific versus source criticism, one does not preclude the other. But there's been a good much of so-called social scientific, that scientific makes me nervous, criticism that suggests that we can do this all objectively, and it turns out, in fact, we can't, as we can see from some of the earlier work of the context group, much of which has now been critiqued substantially or refined and will continue to be so. On the politics stuff, New Testament scholars are obsessed with politics. The problem is, and again, and nationalism would be part of that whole conversation. By what optic does one use? I mean, so do you take a kind of post-colonial lens? Do you do an empire critical lens, and so on? And then what happens is we typically get a Jesus as the political radical, with the word radical meaning everything, right? It's because whatever Jesus does, it has to be radical. I think whatever any Jew is doing in the first century is radical. Recognizing things like, at the time of Jesus, Galilee is not occupied by Roman soldiers. That makes a difference. To what extent was Herod Antipas an okay ruler? He gets thrown out because he tries to up jump over his brother-in-law, but the people in Galilee seem to be, on the whole, not terribly upset with him. So even how do we look at client kings at the time? Missing here is the role of the temple, and how does a temple state function? In terms of nationalism, it might be better to think of ethnos rather than nationalism. I mean, Jews knew that they were Jews, which meant they weren't Samaritans and they weren't Gentiles. But Americans know that they're Americans and we're not Canadians. But then you got to figure out what that means. And then what's life on the border, including questions of mixed marriages. Is a Judean framework the same thing as a Galilean framework? And even what language do we use? Do we talk about Jewish culture? Do we talk about Judean culture? And whatever word we use is in fact politically loaded. And that's that later material. And finally, on the theological concern, which also relates to politics, theology is going to be part of it, but good theology itself would be concerned about matters of justice, because theology and justice are not mutually exclusive, any more than ethics and eschatology are mutually exclusive. And that gets back to that broader package of who Jesus is. I personally do not think that Jesus was terribly worried about Rome. I think Jesus was worried about evil and Satan and any ruler who lords it over other people. But did he have a particular animus against Rome? I don't think so.
Good. We have still time for some conversation. I was reading the questions that are coming from our audience. Some were made dealing with problems that then we have already talked about during our conversation. We have access to these questions, so I'm just reacting to some of them. And in particular, there is a question in which Leonore Gerstein is asking us to provide a couple of examples in which Jesus deal with problems in the same problem in a different way than the rabbis. This is something that unfortunately we cannot do. I mean, if we are talking about Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism, we can see which the tendency is in Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity to deal with some problem. When we talk about Jesus, and I think AJ, you'll agree on this, it's more difficult because it's not that there is a Jewish answer and a Jesus answer.
That's
because
true.
We have many Jewish answers that were one different from the others. So and Jesus is part of this conversation. It's not Jesus and the other Jews. I mean, it's not. I don't know. I mean, this in particular in Christianity, among Christians, is very common. Just to say, I don't know. The Jews believed at the time of Jesus, believed this and that, and then Jesus instead said something different. Then when you deal with history and the history of the Second Temple Judaism, we see that there is not one Jewish answer. I mean, even saying that all the Jews waited for the coming of the Messiah there were Jews who had no idea of a final Messiah, rejected completely, and even those who agreed on the expectation of the final Messiah at the end of times, there were different ways of expecting the Messiah. So, I understand. I mean, many questions are telling now are emphasizing how difficult it is to deal with this topic historically, because we have the burden of centuries of theological hostility. But if we approach historically, we have to try to avoid this kind of anachronisms.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I'm also checking some of the Q&A also, and there are a couple that I do think are worth addressing. There's one question about whether there's a better, less loaded term than Gentile to describe non-Jews. The other available term is pagan, and pagan has more negative connotations in certain circles, and we also have to deal with questions of modern paganism, which is not the same thing as ancient paganism. So to me, Gentile is the most neutral term I know. As opposed to saying not Jews, not Samaritans. But pagan would be the alternative. If you're thinking Gentile means Goyish, and Goyish in Yiddish has a negative sense to it. I'm not talking about Goyish in a Yiddish sense. I'm just talking about Gentiles. In terms of differences between, again, from the chat, from the Q&A, differences between the rabbis and Jesus, here's one major difference. Jesus is what we would call today, and the technical term is in fact charismatic leader. So is John the Baptist. Jesus has a group of like an inner circle of 12 and then an inner circle of 3, but he's not taking votes like saying, let's take a vote. Do you think we got to go from Galilee to Judea? He is the leader of this group, as John the Baptist is. Pharisees, there might be like head Pharisees, but they're more communitarian. The rabbinic sources are more communitarian. And what we find in that gradual separation between Christianity and Judaism is Judaism tends to pull back on that type of charismatic leader. Because you don't want somebody who's up there kind of like Jesus, pulling back on that. And you only see a break on that with the beginning of the Hasidic movement when you start getting major leaders coming up again. So Jesus, the individual thinker. And then what happens with any charismatic leader? When he dies, the movement will necessarily change because you no longer have that firm leadership.
There are a couple of questions. I mean, we continue this way in conversation now with our audience. There are a couple of questions that attracted my attention, in particular, questions about the influence of some historical events like the destruction of the temple and the Bar Kokhba revolt in the emergence of what we call rabbinic Judaism and Christianity on the other end. And yes, I mean, for me, for instance, the destruction of the temple is certainly a very, very important because moment, not only because of the trauma of the destruction of the temple, the need of rethinking Judaism in different terms, not around the temple, but also because the different groups lost their common house. For me, this is very, very important. You know, if you read also Christian sources, you see that until the year 70, the followers of Jesus, the first followers of Jesus, including Paul, were attending the temple.
Yes.
In the temple, there were no distinctions. And so I think this is important. Also the Bar Kokhba revolt, because I think that the realization that the temple was not going to be rebuilt did not come until the Bar Kokhba revolt.
I think that's right.
We have evidence archaeologically that the Jewish communities continue to collect money for the rebuilding of the temple. After all, the temple had been the first temple was destroyed and then rebuilt after 70 years. Why don't think the same? And I think that the Bar Kokhba had revolt has a tremendous impact, because with the Bar Kokhba revolt came also the realization that the temple was not going to be rebuilt. And if I may add the last thing about Gentiles, I mean, we have always to remember that many Gentiles were already part in some way of Judaism, even before Jesus, because in Jewish Hellenistic communities, God-fearers, I mean, people that Gentiles that has accepted Jewish monotheism were already in some way affiliated with Judaism. This is the reason why using pagans that emphasize a little bit the polytheistic aspect of not all Gentiles were polytheists. I mean, and many of them were sympathizers of Judaism.
Or another way of phrasing it is to think of them all as somehow slightly polytheistic, because today we think of like there's monotheism, like there's one God and that's it. But back then even Jews believed in angels and demons and varieties of supernatural beings. And, in the Roman Empire, you could become a god. Like if you were a Caesar, you got elected, you could ascend, and then they back trace it to your birth. So this line between humanity and divinity is a little bit more fuzzy in the first century than we would have it today. Which
thank you.
It's more confusing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we should end it about here because we're about out of time. But I wanted to really thank both of you, thank all three of you very much for being a part of this. Thank you to Professor Cataldo, Professor Levine, and Professor Boccaccini. Thank you to all of you who attended, and this is a conversation that clearly could go on for a lot longer. It's gone on for 2,000 years already, and could clearly go on for much longer than we have time for. But I do see in one of the questions that has been posed that that Professor Levine will be back in Michigan, so to speak, appearing on NPR on WGVU's Common Threads on April 10th, or April 11th and April 18th to discuss the new book. And Professors Cataldo and Boccaccini are in Michigan regularly. So I hope they'll have the opportunity to continue these conversations in the future. And I thank the Padnos family very much for making this possible. It's been a real pleasure to hear this conversation, to be a part of it. And I look forward to it continuing in future years. And finally, thank you to Kelsey Keeves, who set this up for us on the backside. So again, thank you all for coming, and thank you to the panelists. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I hope all of you enjoyed being a part of it as well. So thank you very much, and have a pleasant evening.
Thank you.